For today, I'll give you a little outline. I want to talk about the connection between leisure and health, including how I define leisure or how I view leisure. Hopefully you will, that will kind of resonate with you as well. And then how I intentionally integrate leisure and prevention sciences, or how I'm advocating for those two things to be integrated, and give you a bit of a case study from my body of work related to leisure boredom. So I'm going to give you the takes home points at the beginning, and I'll wrap up with this as well. But what I'd like you to take away is this association or greater knowledge of this association between leisure and health, a model or a definition or a perspective of leisure as prevention, and then the view that boredom and coping with boredom or promoting boredom coping is a worthwhile prevention target. I don't know that I need to argue some of these things terribly much, too much. I think folks may already have some awareness of this. But I want to start with a little bit of a history of the connection between leisure and health. And it actually fits, unfortunately, I guess, with current COVID times. You may find some connections with this. So leisure and health, a long time ago, and there's a perspective that was endorsed from ancient times through the mid to late 1800s, this perspective of miasma theory, which is the belief that infectious diseases were caused by noxious or bad air or smells that came from rotting matter. And supporters of miasma theory, although the theory is wrong, they advocated for improved ventilation and sanitation. So in response to things like cholera or yellow fever, in response to those epidemics, it really drove broader infrastructure changes in cities related to wastewater systems, and then all the planning that comes along with that and other related systems. And one of the big pieces is it spurred development of parks and green spaces, which brought in fresh air and sunlight and were thought to purify or be a way to combat this noxious air. Proponents of miasma theory were really integral in developing local parks. And if you look at Central Park in New York City, Olmsted was a proponent of that, and he was really critical in getting the land and the formation of those parks as spaces for the public. Related, since we're kind of traveling down a historical lane, another approach to promoting health from a leisure or play perspective, at least from child development, are these common play areas. Before we had playgrounds, there was this sand garden movement where play structures or play areas within communities, especially within larger cities that didn't have green spaces or didn't have play areas for kids. And for kids that in the country, they had dirt or, they had larger spaces to play with, but sand gardens really served as communal play spaces for children. And we know that, playing in sandbox from a child development perspective promotes creative and imaginative play. And if you've ever watched a kid in a sandbox, you can see that in action. So there's a little bit of history between development, healthy development or promoting healthy development, and health, as well as leisure and recreation, including, and this is an example of just how spaces relate to that. I want to bring it back to present day or close to present day. There's an article by Jamison and colleagues which outlined how recreation and parks contribute to health, and I think it serves as a nice framework to share. So they brought up 5 main areas to focus on, and for the sake of time, I'm only going to discuss 3 of these today, which are land and place, built environment, and active living. So land and place refers to the amount of space reserved for recreation and leisure or use for the public good. This can include federal, state, local public lands. I want to add a huge asterisk here that there is a long history that not all public lands serve the public equally. This even goes back to the founding of these spaces. I'm going to put up a reference in a moment by Moet, which is from 2020. It'll be at the top of these references, but he published an article just this year that provides more in-depth history of the formation of public lands and how that aligned, the founders of the public lands, how their perspectives aligned with the eugenics movement and how they were heavily involved in the eugenics movement. So some of the founders of public lands not only believed in conservation and preservation of natural resources, but also conservation and preservation of a racially homogenous group of white individuals. So this issue continues to be evident today, where recreation spaces can be developed may be developed for the public good, but remain unsafe, inaccessible, and unwelcoming to people of color, and specifically Black individuals. So I want to make that statement as a to set the stage for this conversation. When we think about the built environment, that relates to how land is planned and developed and how that's associated with healthy behaviors. I'll give you a few health outcomes in a moment, but just as a quick example, those who live within 2/3 of a mile or a kilometer of a park are more likely to engage in leisure time physical activity. So that's an outcome we kind of see, a well-known and supported outcome. And then we have this body of work related to active living. And so this area of research focuses on how individuals maintain health through an active lifestyle. This includes availability, including what's available in the built environment, but also other strategies to promote active living. So we really have a solid foundation of evidence to support the connection between public health and leisure from a parks and built environment perspective. And so again, this is related to increased physical activity. We see outcomes, reduced overweight status, higher mental health, higher self-rated health, and improved social network. So we have a solid foundation of evidence to support the connection between public health and leisure from this parks perspective. I think I may have just repeated myself, but I do want to give a little bit of background on what leisure is and how I approach leisure as well. So let's talk through that. I could list out the different ways that excuse me, folks define leisure, but I actually think there's a model that I'm going to share that is more helpful on how to view differing aspects or differing factors within leisure. So I want to introduce to you the LACE model. It's also called the Leisure Activities, Context, and Experience model. It's authored by Caldwell, who Ashley mentioned. Dr. Linda Caldwell was my mentor at Penn State and is an emerita faculty of the Recreation Park and Tourism Management program. So I use this model quite a bit in my own work, especially when communicating to others outside of leisure audiences what leisure is. And it's discussed, Caldwell discusses it in relation to youth development, but I think it really can apply across the lifespan. So I'm going to introduce what each of these spokes is within this model. First is the activities and time use. And I would say this is really where the bulk of research has been conducted. You know, the example references are focused on adolescence, but our highly cited works related to time use and highlight the literature on structured versus unstructured time use. And the main takeaway, if I boil it down, at least for adolescents, is unstructured and unsupervised time with peers is associated with negative outcomes such as delinquency. There are boundaries folks have put around what structured means, how frequently it meets, who it's organized by, and we can maybe debate those another day, but I would argue that for adolescents, a balance between structured and unstructured would be ideal. And again, maybe that's another discussion for another day. But when we think about, a lot of work has been done on what individuals are participating in, how frequently they're participating in, where it happens, etc. And so this is kind of a pretty well-researched area, I would say. The context piece really looks at contextual elements that are inherent or embedded in the leisure opportunity or the leisure experience. And if you're familiar with Eccles and Gutman's work on the features of positive developmental settings, then you know what these eight factors are, these 8 contextual features are. So physical and psychological safety, appropriate structure, supportive relationships, opportunities for belonging, opportunities for efficacy and mattering and skill building, and then integration of family, school, and community efforts. So if you look across the lifespan, I would say these may be more or less important depending on the life stage, but factors like safety and belonging are important, I would argue, at all life stages. This is another area where we have at least some, an outline of what these features should look like, and we have had some work in this area. This last piece is experience. And to me, this is where I have focused my research energy and efforts, because I think sometimes this is the missing link. It's not enough to understand what you're doing or who you're doing it with, but we also need to understand how you're experiencing your leisure. And this can include factors like feelings, motivations, constraints. And so I wanted to pause here, and with Vanessa's help, hopefully, fingers crossed, this works. And so I've kind of introduced the LACE model. And for those of you that are here, hopefully you can share with me what part of your own work do you feel like maybe is associated with the LACE model, or have you done any research or involved with any projects that relate to one of these areas? I just thought I'd take a quick poll. And so we have a Zoom poll that you can choose more than one option. And I don't know, Vanessa, if you can help me Oh, there we go.
Got it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So you should see a poll on your screen. So if you've been involved with multiple of these areas, you can say, you know, one of them, you can choose more than one.
This is very fancy, I just have to say.
I've really had to up my Zoom game over the past 6 months.
You've set the bar high for the rest of the semester.
All right, I'll give people a couple more seconds to respond. Give me a chance to take a drink anyway. All right, well, this is really exciting to see. I don't know, Vanessa, if you can share the poll.
Let me end it and then maybe see share results.
Yeah, so here's this is anonymous. Here's what all of you said, that, you know, 2/3 of you are doing research on this contextual aspect, these subjective experience, or excuse me, these features of developmental settings. 1/3 are looking at the activities and time use piece. We have half looking at experience, and then, you know, 1/5 of people say none of these things. So I guess I wanted to highlight that you are all potentially doing this work, but sometimes we don't use the same language. And as we get into our own disciplines, sometimes we're doing similar things, but we're not speaking, in the paper that we wrote about leisure and prevention, we're not singing from the same sheet of music. And I think that's really an opportunity for greater intersection between leisure and prevention, is to start using some of this same language and some of the same words, because we have a lot of research and literature that can build on each other if you're not already explicitly working kind of in an interdisciplinary team. So this was really interesting to see. So thanks for sharing. I do have one other poll later on in the presentation, but we can, all right, I think the poll is down. So when Caldwell summed up this LACE model by saying that these features combine to create conditions that either serve to protect from negative or risky behaviors or promote positive and healthy development. So this language should sound really familiar, but this is the explicit tie to prevention, that there are leisure-related factors that can serve as risk or protective factors for a given health outcome. There's a billboard I want to share with you. I think it's either from Idaho or Wyoming, somewhere in that area, but it makes me smile every time I see it, because before we can get to this, and I'm super curious who changes behavior because of this billboard, or how effective it is at getting youth to avoid substances and instead find a healthy alternative. But that's also a question for another day. But before we can get to this opting for or choosing healthy behaviors, I would say we need to better understand the individual experiences that contribute to risk behavior. And that's where the bulk of my research has looked at these experience factors. And it looks like a number of you have also been doing this as well. The motivation for this presentation, as it was scheduled last November, was because we had this paper come out that really looked at the intersection of leisure and prevention science. It was published in a leisure-focused journal, and so we were trying to bridge these fields and talk about how leisure should be adopting more of a prevention science focus, and what are ways to do that. So some of our conclusions or suggestions were that we should be pushing out leisure science. We should be emphasizing the strengths of leisure research that maybe prevention science hasn't traditionally focused on. And one example of that is the information related to older adults. I think if you attend SPR, it's been slow coming to have presentations or research presented that is really focused on older adults or prevention into the aging kind of area of the lifespan. And so that's one area that leisure science, I think, does have a large body of work that we could apply that information. And then really promoting the context of leisure. So we're kind of all on the same page about what is leisure and what role does it play in health. The other piece is we wanted to pull from prevention science. There are pieces that prevention science does well. I think that leisure would benefit from adopting. So taking a developmental perspective, things like understanding how earlier experience influences behavior now, and how do we account for this natural unfolding of developmental change over time. Framing leisure as prevention, specifically using that language related to risk and protective factors. So in the conclusion of this paper, we made a number of recommendations. I'm just gonna kind of review them here. I know I'm likely talking to the prevention audience here. But we talked about developing a list of comprehensive list of leisure-related risk and protective factors. So it's kind of all there, and it's in one spot and what the evidence indicates. This can then be used to identify gaps and how we can develop a long-term research agenda to promote, to address those gaps. You know, how do we meet the needs of vulnerable and high-need populations, and how we should be piloting programs within these high-need areas. Obviously, relationships and interdisciplinary relationships are critical to, especially when you're talking about bridging fields, so bringing people together with differing perspectives. I already kind of mentioned promoting the preventive aspects of leisure to external audiences and disseminating this outside of the field of leisure sciences. And then something that's already done, I would argue that's already done at Penn State, which is how I ended up in this role and giving this presentation, is training leisure researchers in prevention science. And I really credit PAMT for helping me bridge these connections. So I'm gonna switch gears a little bit, and I want to talk, so I've given a kind of an argument, and I don't think that I have to argue too forcefully with you all about this intersection of leisure and prevention science. But now I want to move from looking conceptually to looking at a body of research or a body of work related to boredom. And I want to do that by talking about the book Horton Hatches the Egg. So I don't know if folks have read Horton Hatches the Egg. If you have small children, maybe you have. If you haven't, I'll give you the rundown as we go through the presentation. So in Horton Hatches the Egg, this is Maisie, and she's a bird that's laying an egg. And this is Horton, and he's the elephant in the story. So there's Horton. And here's some text from the beginning of the book. And I'm gonna read it to you just as kind of a starter. So, sighed Maisie, a lazy bird hatching an egg. I'm tired and I'm bored and I've kinks in my leg from just sitting here day after day. It's work, how I hate it. I'd much rather play. So I wanna highlight a little piece. And she talks about how she'd really like to find someone to sit on her egg and she wants to leave, like she's out. So I want to highlight this section, that Maisie talks about how she's bored. And she's bored because she's doing the same thing day after day after day. She doesn't find a lot of meaning in what she's doing, and she wants to be gone. So we're going to come back to Maisie and Horton. Well, I want to give you a definition of boredom so we're all on the same page. So boredom is defined, and this is a definition that I frequently use. It's defined as the aversive state of wanting but being unable to engage in satisfying activity. So here we have a moment where we're really wanting to find satisfaction in the situation that's happening around us, but we're having a difficult time engaging at a level that fits for us. The other piece I want to highlight is it's referenced as a state. Could be momentary. It may happen every once in a while, but it is a brief period of time. So I'm going to crosswalk a couple things here. And again, we're going to keep talking about boredom. So these three areas should look familiar to you. These are from the SPR standards of practice. And I know they're getting could be used to be updating, a little bit out of date, but I still find them valuable as these foundational elements of epidemiology, intervention development, and methodology. And then I'm going to cross it with these three areas from the LACE model. So we have activity, context, and experience. And I already mentioned that much of my work focuses on this column of experience. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today in this kind of case study. So I'm going to use these icons to talk about specific pieces related to epidemiology. What's the prevalence of boredom? How is it associated with other outcomes? And then how does that inform interventions from a prevention perspective? All right, so first I want to talk about trends, and I'll just give you kind of brief snippets of studies and the major findings. So we use monitoring the future data from 8th, 10th, and 12th graders. Unfortunately, they don't ask about boredom in 6th grade, so we couldn't use 6th graders. But from 8th, 10th, and 12th graders asking, how does boredom change developmentally? Which was the question, if I tell you a secret, it was the question that I was most interested in. And then how does it change historically? So what we found is there were increasing levels of boredom over time. I think the more exciting findings were actually historically than developmentally. We did see some changes across grade, and then we saw differences in both of these trends by sex. So I'll kind of walk you through briefly these results. For the purposes of the presentation and being on the screen, I'm zooming in on kind of the middle part of the scale so you can clearly differentiate the males and females on this slide. But what this depicts is we used a method called join point, and this allows for, if you think of like a spline regression model, it allows for in this case, because of the number of years we had, it allowed for 1 point, so we could look at two trend lines over time. And so what we saw is that when we look at males and female across males and females, we saw that there was an annual percent change or an increase in boredom of 1.14. It's not a huge annual percent change, but we do see it occurring from 2010 through 2017. So that bar at the bottom represents how the duration of that change. We didn't see a change between 2008 and 2010. When we split this out by females, we can see that females still had from 2010 to 2017 an annual percent change of about 1.7. When you look at boys, it was only from 2014 to 2017, and it was still similar, about 1.6. But what I think this figure depicts is that not only boys and girls may be increasing at a similar annual percent change, but it's happening earlier for girls, and it's happening at a higher, girls are starting out higher. So we're seeing changes over time in boredom, and we're seeing differences by sex, and it's more so impacting females. We split this out by grade, and I'm just gonna give you kind of a slide that gives an overview of those findings. For girls, we saw an increase between 2008 and 2017. We didn't see an increase for boys. For 10th graders, we saw an increase for girls only from 2010 through 2017. Obviously a much steeper increase for girls than it was for boys. And then for 12th graders, we saw an increase across the whole time span, 2008 to 2017, and it was a steeper increase for girls than boys. So we see something going on development historically in this data over time. When we look developmentally, unfortunately, we don't have that 6th grade data, which I would really love to be able to have. But we do see differences by sex and boredom across grades, so across 8th, 10th, and 12th grade. We see that girls start out higher in 8th grade and they start to kind of come down. So I wonder, are they peaking in 8th grade? And then boys are just peaking 2 years later related to boredom, or what really is happening there? So I think there's more to be explored from a developmental perspective, but based on the literature, we do know from other studies that we expect boredom to kind of peak in middle school or early high school. So this kind of fits in line with that. So if we jump back to Horton hatches the egg. So come back to Maisie and Horton, and I want to kind of introduce another piece of looking at changes in boredom as well as an outcome, and in this case, looking at substance use. I'm going to give you some fake data just as an example. So here I pulled out Maisie and Horton, and if we look at, if this is a figure of boredom, we see that Maisie has just a higher level of boredom on average than Horton does. And so in another paper, we wanted to know, well, from a state and trait perspective, how do state and trait measures of boredom, how are those associated with outcomes such as substance use? So we had data from high schoolers. Unfortunately, it was data measured biannually, so basically once a semester. Not the ideal data to be looking at state and trait measures, but we did detrend that data to get mean levels and then fluctuations around those means. And we found that those with higher state and trait boredom, both of those were associated, were more likely to use substances. And then we had an interaction between state and trait boredom. So to give you an example, if on this top line, if we think of how that's associated with substance use, again, this top individual who's higher in boredom is more likely to be using substances. And then on occasion, when they're more bored than usual, they're also more likely to be using substances. So it could be that Maisie is just a bird that's more bored than usual. And Horton is able to deal with his boredom more effectively. There are a few different ways to deal with a boring situation, and both of which Dr. Seuss captures in this book. So from a regulatory perspective, we can either approach to re-engage and bring stimulation, or we can avoid to withdraw from an unpleasant situation. Although Horton never says he's bored in the book, he does re-engage with the situation. While sitting on the egg, he repeatedly says, "I meant what I said, and I said what I meant, and elephants faithful 100%. If you read the book, you probably know that line. So he's bringing personal meaning to the task at hand by connecting it to his own values. Maisie, on the other hand, can't wait to be relieved of responsibility of sitting on the egg. So she's really the definition of avoiding or avoidance by flying away, and she never comes back. She gets Horton to sit on the egg and she does not return. From a research perspective, we can ask folks on surveys to retrospectively report their boredom, but we can also induce boredom within a lab setting, which would allow for an opportunity to get real-time information about what's going on when someone's entering into a state of boredom. So we did just this. So I partnered with a colleague at WSU, Dr. Sammy Perroni, who researches executive control and emotion regulation from a developmental neuroscience perspective. Just so if there are any students in the audience, so you can understand how sometimes these collaborations come about, we had a departmental retreat and we rode together for about 3.5, 4 hours in the car. And then by the end of the trip, this is where we were ready to do a study together. And so this is where we ended up. As you can see from the photo, we used EEG, and this is totally Sammy's area. And so it's, although I've read EEG studies, I had never had the opportunity to participate in one or to participate in developing one. So it was a really exciting opportunity for me. So we wanted to look at how these regulatory processes are associated with experiences of boredom. One of the things I had to get used to in EEG studies is the small sample size. It's so arduous to bring people in, get them fitted, put them through the task, et cetera, that this is a normal sample size, at least from that perspective. What we were looking at is something called frontal EEG asymmetry. So it's also FEA. It's known to be a neural correlate of regulatory processes, which are thought to reflect behavioral activation and inhibition. And prior research indicates that people who exhibit greater left activity during baseline exhibit a more approach-oriented behaviors, while those who show less left activity exhibit more avoidance-oriented behaviors. And the reason FEA is interesting is because it reflects an intention to act in an approach or avoidant fashion, even in the absence of behaviors and overt action. I'm going to kind of give you an idea of what this process looked like. So what we had people come into the lab, and then we gave them the task of peg turning. And while you all are passively watching it, the individuals in the lab had to click a button to turn a peg a quarter turn each time. And so you might be bored just watching this, but we had individuals do this task for about 9 to 10 minutes on average. And then we looked at what are this FEA and how does it change as folks are entering a state of boredom. We double checked to make sure that peg turning induced boredom, and in fact it did. And what we found is that the individuals low in boredom, as measured by other leisure boredom and boredom scales, exhibit a leftward shift in FEA activity over time. So here's a figure of that. As a reminder, individuals who exhibit this greater left activity are more approach-oriented, and the movement to rightward are more avoidance-oriented. And so we see that people high in leisure boredom, as the task moved along, they exhibited greater rightward shift. And so those individuals who report high levels of leisure boredom are more likely to have avoidance-oriented behaviors, which means that they are potentially less likely to be able to effectively cope with boredom. Our research coordinator at the conclusion of this, as you're kind of cleaning up and taking the cap off, was asking participants how you dealt with this. And so I think that really spurred kind of the next study. Some folks said that they were rehearsing Christmas songs for an upcoming concert in their head, or they were thinking of all the TV shows they like. So people were using these cognitive strategies to cope during this boring time. This really relates to the literature, that there is this call for understanding what are the causes of boredom, and because that's going to be a necessary step before we can then promote healthy boredom coping. Now, if we bring this back to COVID, this is an Onion headline that made me laugh. Of course, it came out in the end of March, where we were in a different experience within COVID, but I don't think it was nobody was violently looting, but there was a run on puzzles. There was a run on all sorts. There was like sourdough and yeast, and people were taking up all of these hobbies. And it's something that hasn't gone away. Not everyone is, purchasing a boat is not in everyone's capacity, but you still see some evidence of this, that these outdoor recreation pursuits or hobbies are still in high demand. If you've tried to, buy a kayak or purchase some outdoor activity, equipment, then you've seen this happening in action. So we really wanted to understand, how is boredom changing because of COVID? I have another quick poll, and it's the second of the two polls, if Vanessa can help me out with that. There we go. So I'm curious how COVID has impacted your experience of boredom. It's so fun to be on the other side because I can see how it's changing as people are filling out the poll. All right, it looks like it's slowing down. Can we share it?
Mm-hmm.
All right, so half of folks say that their experiences of boredom have increased. A third have said that they've decreased, and then about a fifth have said that there is no change. So I'm going to share with you kind of some other trends in boredom related to COVID that we've observed or that we've tried to collect, and see how it resonates with the half of you that have increased your boredom. So we're going to revisit this, but this is really interesting to see. All right. So at the beginning, I think it was March 14th, was a Friday. Oh, so Daniel said it's impacted my boredom immensely. Because you're more bored or less bored, Daniel? As you type it in.
Much more bored.
Much more bored, okay.
So there wasn't a high enough category for me, so I wanted to add that one in there.
Well, I think the students we've collected data from are saying that exact thing, and they have some very emphatic responses when we ask them about their boredom. So what you're reporting, Daniel, is definitely in line with what we're hearing from others. What I've shared on the screen is on March 14th was the day, at least in Washington State, that the governor closed K-12 public instruction and moved it virtually. And I thought, I wish I could capture this in some way. My background is not in analyzing Twitter, but I did find a service that basically would go back the past 14 days. And so we could at least get a pre-COVID look. And I had a feeling this was going to ramp up. Obviously, no idea where we were going to end up, or that we'd still be here, at this point in time. But I started collecting responses that included a hashtag of COVID-19 and the word bored. There's some issues with this. I think people aren't using this hashtag anymore. There are others issues with this data cleaning, but you can kind of see the trend that there was a peak, towards the end of March, beginning of April, a lot more mentions. And if I had to guess, in some ways, some of this was anticipatory boredom, that things were locking down, we were expecting to be bored, or that people were like, I don't know what to do now that I can't go out and engage. I was trying to look at another way, saying, okay, this maybe isn't the cleanest data. Do we have something a little better? One other way is to look at Google Trends. And so for Google Trends, the numbers here represent search interest relative to the highest point on the chart. So for example, a value of 100 is the peak popularity for this term, and then 50 means it's half as popular. You can see that this peaks at, around March of this year. And in fact, if we zoom in only to this year, you can see there this peak is again. So we are seeing this increase in people searching for boredom, people talking about boredom related to COVID. We happened to collect a survey last fall related to boredom coping of students at a large public university in the Pacific Northwest. So we had quite a large sample from last fall. That data was anonymous. However, we collected their email address for them to get their incentive. So we used the sample of those who responded with their email address and sent out another boredom coping survey after COVID, post-COVID. So we're still working on getting this data out, but I wanted to give you a little snippet of it. We had 64 people who responded to this follow-up survey, or wave 2 of it. What the findings were is we saw increases in boredom, just like Daniel is saying. Let me orient you to this scale. We gave a slider scale that went from -10 to 10 and asked how COVID had impacted your experience of boredom. No one answered below a -6. And the average was 5.9. And then the bar is the standard deviation around that. So we do see that people are saying that their boredom has increased, or young adults are saying that their boredom has increased. But one of the questions we had is, how are folks coping with boredom? And we gave them a few categories, but we also let them answer open-ended. So I wanted to share a few, just a few kind of takeaways from how they're coping with boredom. From a positive perspective, only 3% responded that they engaged in behavior that they know is risky. Now, we could talk about debate, you know, how someone subjectively knows something is risky, but people are saying, I did a low effort but meaningful activity, like cooking or cleaning. We had a lot of, most folks indulged in a guilty pleasure, like binging on Netflix. There's a lot of Netflix and TV and social media time. But we do see folks that are kind of engaging in this cognitive approach, right? I remind myself why it's important to practice physical distancing at this time. I'm bringing meaning back into the situation and what I'm doing. And then they talk about some other, you know, around half of people say they're socially connecting, they're trying something new, which is great to see, or I changed my activity to match the energy level I have at the moment. I wanted to share just a word cloud of what qualitative responses we got to how people are coping with boredom during COVID. And I'm going to share some highlights of these responses. So some folks said, I created a schedule with set alarms to change activities. I've begun to listen to music while I clean. Think of activities that will benefit me. I've put more effort, and some of you instructors might like to hear this, I put more effort into schoolwork. I've stopped worrying or caring about the stress of my job. Some folks are trying to provide more structure, like the person that set alarms, while some folks are trying to provide a different structure maybe. So someone says, I just try and do different things every day rather than settle into routine. Someone says, I've been more active and done a lot more schoolwork, or I scroll through social media to watch a show or movie. We do have responses of people that say, I have never been more bored in my life. And now that I have all this free time, I'm even more bored than I have been before. So I was really curious to hear from kind of an academic audience how you all were experiencing boredom too. And so I wasn't sure if the move to virtual has brought more email or more more tasks in other areas of life. But we still saw about half of people saying that they are experiencing more boredom than they typically do. And so I think that automatically points to an area where we can promote healthy boredom coping. How do we help people bring meaning and structure to their day? So we know that boredom is already a target for environmental prevention approaches. I agree, more email doesn't necessarily mean less boredom. It means more overwhelm for me. I don't know about others. We know that boredom is already a target for environmental prevention approaches. And in this case, Washington, the state, the healthcare authority who oversees physical and behavioral health. So they did an environmental substance use prevention campaign on college campuses, I guess alcohol campaign on college campuses. And they had a number of these messages. And so they were about how to cope and how to deal with stress. But one of them explicitly called out boredom. And they said, you should rethink drinking for boredom. You have other options. We also know there have been effective school-based prevention programs addressing life skills and leisure-related constructs, including boredom. So Caldwell's Health and Smith's HealthWise program did that in an international setting. So right now, we're looking at an online intervention to promote healthy boredom coping as part of a broader leisure education intervention. One outlet for this could be a place like a first-year course that's promoting life skills where this could be inserted into that. But we could also do this at a broader setting, you know, supporting parents to teach their kids how to effectively cope with boredom when they experience it. If you have kids, I've heard them talk about how they're bored, and it's really a teaching opportunity or an opportunity for me to kind of model and help them develop the skills on how they navigate that experience. So when we think of this kind of online intervention to promote healthy boredom coping, my perspective or the thought process so far is, given what we know and kind of what I presented, this would take a personalized feedback approach where the information the individual provides is then used to provide a tailored response. We really need to be matching, you know, the approach that you're taking to address boredom to the cause of your boredom. And then finding different ways to, is this a time where we need to approach or re-engage the situation, or a time where maybe we can pull back and find something to do that's distracting us from what's going on at the moment? And I think what you're seeing in COVID is we're seeing both of those things, right? We're seeing ways to re-engage, and we saw those in the examples. I'm reminding myself why this is important, versus also finding ways to distract ourselves from not only COVID, but all of the other kind of chaos in the world. I want to share some main takeaways, and then I'll also help you wrap up Horton hatches the egg if you don't know the story. So as a reminder, the main takeaways were I wanted to articulate the connection between leisure and health, so you could see that it's been a focus historically, and it continues to be a focus today. I wanted to give you or leave you with a perspective or a model of leisure as prevention, as well as a perspective or a model of what leisure is. And then articulate that boredom coping is a worthwhile prevention target. So I want to first thank you, but two, I want to wrap up Horton hatches the egg. So after Maisie convinces Horton to sit on the egg through all sorts of trials and tribulations, he ends up in a circus, and Maisie spots him in the circus and was like, hey, I know you. And then the egg begins to hatch. And she's like, oh, you give me that egg back, like that's my egg. And Horton's like, wait, I sat on this for so long. Well, then it hatches and it becomes out part bird, part elephant. So Horton and the elephant bird get to go back home and be happy. So with that, thank you for your participation and your engagement. And I'm happy there's about 14 minutes to answer some questions or engage in discussion about this or whatever else you'd like to. I will end my slideshow too.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. That was such a great talk. I think I was hoping at the beginning of your talk that you would have some data about boredom during COVID, because I think that's just it's so interesting, and I'm just thinking so much about how boredom has just probably evolved over time too. Where also like I wonder if people would even describe it as boredom that they're experiencing now versus just like frustration or despair or other sorts of things. I was wondering if you've done any work with I wonder if like mindfulness fits in this way at all, about being able to kind of like sit with your boredom and kind of just acknowledging that and then being able to process it in that way.
Yeah, I don't think boredom is inherently good or bad, but what I would say is we need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And this is also something I'm trying to teach my kids when we talk about how are you feeling right now? Are you feeling boredom? And ooh, does that feel kind of icky to you? Or just sitting with that discomfort. I think, and I don't have this in the slides because I don't have all of the evidence to support this claim, but we saw that trend of increases in boredom. And I think that fits with a lot of other trends we're seeing in adolescence. So higher rates of poor mental health, depression, anxiety, higher rates of obviously engagement online. And I don't want to say all those things are causal with each other. So that's part of why I was hesitating. But I do think for me, it points to this broader dissatisfaction that we're not satisfied with how our time is spent. And it's hard now that we have things to occupy ourselves that we aren't forced to sit with that dissatisfaction. And so I do agree, and I would encourage folks to get comfortable being uncomfortable in some ways, and to help us, one, identify, oh, I am feeling bored, and then to walk through that process of, how we can deal with that situation. I got off on a tangent, and I think I forgot the last part of your question. I apologize.
No, I was just wondering if you had done anything with mindfulness-based interventions at all.
So I think I haven't, but I think, when we think about the approach and avoidance piece, the ways of coping with boredom, at least some of them have been studied, and more so in educational settings, are from an approach and avoidance perspective. So in a classroom, it's very different than in your free time. There's a lot more constraints, obviously, on it. But when we look at approach and avoidance, we can do things like be mindful of why we're doing what we're doing. So, okay, it's important for me to learn this because, or we can also bring our attention back to the situation by, taking notes on the topic at hand. But I think the mindfulness piece is important because if we want to get out of this boring experience or find something more satisfying, we're going to have to bring some meaning to it. And that's going to have to require some self-reflection on what are things that I like to do and they're meaningful for me. And how can I switch the situation from something that I don't like to something that I do? And so it's going to require some level of introspection and insight to be able to do that.
Yeah.
Elizabeth, thank you so much. That was a great talk. I really enjoyed it. Early on in the talk, or maybe toward the middle, you alluded to this idea of tailoring an intervention or messaging to fit with something that might work for that individual. I just wondered if you could say a little more about that, or if you had any thoughts about future directions in that area.
Yeah, it's called a MAC model of boredom. It's authored by Aaron Westgate, and the MAC stands for meaning and attention components. Oh, I should know that. Anyway, the meaning and attention are the key feature. I think it's meaning and attention components model of boredom. And so I think those meaning and attention pieces are going to be important for us understanding when we're entering a boring situation, what is it about the situation that typically contributes to our boredom? One of the things I didn't get into is, I talked about state and trait, but we do know that there's, at least in our samples, there's usually about 10% of the sample that exhibits relatively chronic high levels of boredom. And those are, high levels of boredom, at least from a trait perspective, have been associated with difficulty with attention, whether that's due to diagnoses like ADHD or things like traumatic brain injury. We know that folks who have difficulty attending are going to have difficulty, are more likely to experience boredom and have difficulty in regulating those emotions or dealing with those situations. So I would imagine that, or the way we're approaching this is, especially from the MAC model, is, what typically gets you into a boring situation, and how can we address those meaning and attention components to re-engage you in a way that satisfies you? The paper that Aaron Westgate put out, and I'm not going to remember the year, but that talks about this MAC model, also talks about how we can effectively cope with these situations. And I don't think she uses the word coping, but how we get out of this boring situation from a meaning and attention perspective. And so I think those are going to be important to then help determine how we can cope or how we can deal with this. So that's how I would envision that happening. Right now, a graduate student, her thesis is this boredom coping data, and she's looking at how, since this MAC model is fairly new, how well it fits with existing measures of boredom susceptibility, of boredom proneness, how well are those associated, or how well does the MAC model differentiate between high and low levels of boredom. So still some more work to be done, or that's happening right now.
Thanks a lot. There's a question from Jennifer Maggs. Jen, do you want me to read it out loud, or do you want to pop in? You read, okay. So Jennifer asks, can a feeling of boredom also come from inactivity that is caused by fatigue or sleepiness? Not enough sleep leads to tired the next day, leads to lots of free time, especially in COVID times, leads to lack of motivation to do what you actually can do, leads to more boredom, selection of low interest, low energy, low reward activities like Netflix, leads to less sleep. And so it sounds like a cycle that people get caught in. She says, that's the question, is that a thing?
Well, when we looked at how how students were coping with boredom, we saw a lot of Netflix. I mean, that was one of the things that almost everyone endorsed. I've been binging, engaging in a guilty pleasure like binging Netflix. So we already do see a lot of that. I think COVID is an especially interesting time where, one, obviously we have this repetition in our environment, and I think that might be changing as maybe folks get out, and there's where we can tie it to green spaces, the density of where you live, how much flexibility do you have in getting out. But I do agree that I think for folks, there just may not be the level of energy that you have, especially as we move longer and longer into the pandemic, to engage in some of these, in some of the normal activities that you would do. So we might have, one of the ways that we talked about that within the study is, have you matched your activities to your current level of energy? So, and that's where I think the scrolling through social media, binging Netflix, watching TV, some of those low effort activities people are engaging in, but they're also engaging in low energy or low effort things that are still productive in a sense, like cleaning up around the house, or some of those types of activities that are kind of still meaningful in their lives but have low effort. So I do think that there's this association, but I don't know how much is kind of pandemic weariness, if that's a term, as we go in time. Yeah, but obviously, you know, associations between boredom and motivation as well. We've seen that in other studies. So if you're able to match your level of energy to an activity that you're doing, kind of that's already, I think that's a nice sign that you're already self-aware to know where you're sitting and what's going to fit for you. Then the other question is, but if you're doing that all the time and we don't have any capacity for anything else than these kind of low energy passive activities, then there's maybe another issue going on, right? Usually we want a balance of leisure activities, right? We want things that are high energy versus things that are low energy, and having a large kind of repertoire of leisure activities. So.
Do you feel like it seemed, to me, it just, as not an expert in this area, it seems critical to think about, to consider whether the person is more introverted or extroverted?
Yeah.
And that beyond the time of COVID and COVID fatigue, but just in general, is those kinds of personality traits things that are looked at often in the boredom literature?
No, and I think there's some of that, but I think that's part of what's missing in boredom is that we do a lot of work related to constraints, and there are some intrapersonal, interpersonal, structural constraints that we look at related to leisure, and then how people negotiate those constraints. But I think some of these personality features, maybe like introversion, extroversion, so are things that haven't been looked at as frequently, at least not in my experience within the leisure sciences. And so I think that's a nice example of places to grow and why there's this need for kind of more interdisciplinary research. I saw the question by Sarah about people who fill most of their free time with social media or YouTube. We did a study where we did focus groups to ask, and also with a young adult sample, but to ask about how they define healthy and unhealthy leisure. And one of the interesting things is that the same activity could be healthy and unhealthy. So I can use TV or YouTube or Netflix as a means to escape after a stressful day, or kind of just chill out, zone out for a little bit so I have enough energy for the next day. But there's a balance there, and there's frequently a tipping point that's going to be person specific. If I sit on the couch and watch Netflix all day, that turns this healthy activity that could be restorative for me into an unhealthy activity where I've done too much of it. So what we found is that unhealthy leisure activity was really characterized by this sense of out of control or this sense of excess. And so I think that's a little bit of maybe what's happening here, at least in your question, Sarah, is that when we're feeling, that's an easy way to, one, get sucked in because they're good at sucking us in. If you've watched that Social Connection movie on Netflix, you may have seen some of that. But they're good at sucking us in, and it's easy to kind of zone out and do that for hours and hours on end. So that kind of came to mind when you posed that question, Sarah. I won't necessarily dive into the screen time and youth literature today with 2 minutes left.
Any last burning questions?
I would say obviously people are welcome to reach out to me. Unfortunately, since I couldn't be there were a number of people I was going to meet with, and I had different things in mind to chat with you about. And so hopefully I will get to do that again. But if there are other questions or other ideas or collaborations, we have lots of data now on boredom coping and on boredom. So it's at a point where I'm happy to collaborate to kind of, if there are folks who have questions of interest that you want to work on, we can do that. Or if, this is kind of one area of my work, the other area is this extension related these efforts. And so I know I didn't get a chance to talk about that today, but I'm happy to chat with folks about extension and prevention and what that has looked like, at least in Washington State. So.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I mean, maybe you could give us a parting word, knowing our audience of, PRC staff and faculty, positive ways to cope with boredom today. Any preferred approaches you'd recommend that we reach out to?
I would say
boredom.
I would say balance is a good thing. So if you feel like you need a day to spend all day on Netflix, or I don't have children, or I have children. I don't always have the luxury to do that. But finding a way to escape. This is such a crazy time, and bringing some meaning into your life and some structure and finding a way to cope. I think I have found that to be really beneficial, and that's what we've kind of advocated for, is how can we, now that our home and our work is all the same thing, how do we still add some structure and meaning to our day? And in those times when it does get overwhelming, again, connecting it back to how does this, what I've done at least personally is, how is this meaningful for me? Okay, I'm tired of being at home. I'm tired that I can't go do the things I do, but why am I doing this? It's not, I'm not always effective at that. But again, bringing meaning back to the situation is another approach that I encourage. And do what works for you.
It's great advice. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you again. I appreciate it, the opportunity to be here.
Great,
Yeah.
great to have you. Bye.